We could consider metapsychology in terms of topical aspects of the human psyche, in the sense that it would be the anatomy of our psyche. Topical meaning that we can locate. We can locate where these different instances are running. So let's talk about these places in question in our psyche. Let's try and imagine, say, an iceberg. Now, the part of the iceberg that is underneath the water would be our subconscious. Almost near the surface would be a small part that we could call the preconscious. And above water is what is known as the conscious mind. And that's what we are aware of and what we know about ourselves. For instance, I know that I like chocolate and not vanilla, but I don't know what kind of defense mechanisms my subconscious sets up faced with a difficult situation. We could say that these are almost organs inside the anatomy, inside the body being the psyche, and they interact with each other just as our inner organs do. Our inner organs are linked together and interact together in order to have the whole body functioning. Our psyche works in the very same way, where these organs are the id, the ego, and the superego. You'll find a diagram of this iceberg image and be able to locate ego, superego, and id inside the iceberg, and locate also the topical aspects of the psyche in terms of conscious, preconscious, and subconscious. You have this normally in your attached file along with the other documents for this first, which is your bibliography, your program as well. Getting back to the topical aspects of the psyche, now that you've looked at that, you'll notice that superego resides at the same time in the subconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. The ego is also present in the conscious, the preconscious, and subconscious, and only the id is present completely in the subconscious. There are no conscious aspects to the id. And we're going to describe these three different of the psyche now. Let's start with the id. We'll consider in psychoanalysis that the id is what makes up our psyche from the beginning. So from the beginning, meaning even before birth, as the fetus is developing and his brain cells are starting to develop. In the psyche, there is only id. Considers all of the basic primary instincts, such as survival, obviously, which is going to gather all sorts of other basic needs, such as hunger, eating, shelter. These basic needs are what are going to make sure that he can survive to his environment after birth. Now, of course, things are never static in psychoanalysis, and things are never static in our brain. So when we talk about these different issues, you have to keep in mind that we're talking about processes that are constantly evolving and constantly growing and changing. So it's never only one thing. It starts as something and then it can grow into something else. But the id at the beginning really is just the source of all primal desires and needs, which are all based around survival. Based on that, you can pretty much gather that there is no capacity to understand right and wrong, to consider even the outside world in terms of other people or reality. This is only internal and the source of all drives. This idea about drives is also very important. We're going to develop that a little later on and actually talk about that in our next session. But the id is where the drives are originated, and this is going to be its primal function. is to alleviate the pressure that the drive tends to put on the psyche apparatus. You can understand that the id has also no concept of time. Now, right now, and anybody who has been in contact with a baby or a small child will notice that when they want something, they want it right now. There's no ability to really perceive time in the sense of, well, wait, I'm making your bottle now. Don't worry, you can stop crying. I know you're hungry. They don't understand that. They need it right now. There's no ability to conceive time at this point. This is what makes the id particular, different from the two other instances, where the id has no ability to contact the outside experience. Therefore, it cannot be influenced by the environment, by the outside experience. That's why this idea is important, because though we did just say that things evolve and things change and things are part of a process, the id is really the only part of our psyche that cannot be influenced by the outside world. It is what it is. And let's just say again that what that is the source of our desires, the source of all of our drives that become our desires. Be really important because it doesn't change and it doesn't have any notion of time. We could say that the id, about the id and its different characteristics, that it's very disorganized, based on what is called in psychoanalysis, because it is based on to be part of survival. So it's not logical, doesn't have any sense of moral values, doesn't know what's right or what's wrong, it doesn't have any sense of that. It's very basic, it's very based on instinct, selfish as well. Selfish in the sense that it does not recognize the outside world and therefore it does not recognize drives and desires. And the other characteristic to be reminded is that it only resides in the subconscious. It's because it only resides in the subconscious that it has no it cannot be influenced through outside experience. Now, normally this should make sense to you because you can understand if you picture it inside the situation that is of a small baby, or you can see how he acts that way. He acts in a unorganized manner. He's very insistent. He wants his needs to be met right away, his desires to be met right away. He has no notion yet of what's right and wrong. If he wants his friend's candy, he'll just take it. He's not being mean. He just doesn't realize what's right and wrong. That's something that we teach him later. That's another part that's at work there. He's really just concerned with being able to survive, and so basic needs pretty much evolve around being fed, well cared for, warm and comfortable, and not in any kind of pain, obviously. Why would we talk about pain at this point? Because that's part of one of the principles that rules psychoanalysis. There's a few principles that regulate the laws, internal laws of our psyche. The first one is called the pleasure principle. Now, maybe if you're a little bit familiar with Freud, you've read his articles and papers about the pleasure principle. That's also a recommendation if you're feeling motivated to look that up. Anyway, the pleasure principle says that everything we do in order to pleasure out of it. That our basic drives are regulated by this pleasure principle. We don't want displeasure. We want pleasure. So you're probably thinking about people who actually go out and look for them, like in masochism. But that's a different thing. We're not talking about that. We're talking about our id's basic desire being ruled by the pleasure principle. And that's probably just a natural fact of all living things. I think we could extend that basic notion also the animal world and maybe even plants. So the id is part of this to be satisfied immediately. For example, when you feel hungry, you want to drink. It seems normal, but the id won't stand wait. It won't stand any kind of delay in it needs to be met right away. So as adults, we are able to say, well, I'm feeling thirsty. There's not anything for me to drink right now, so I'm going to wait a little later and I'll be able to have a glass of water as soon as I get home, for instance. That doesn't work with a baby, right? I think that you've probably noticed that. It's got to be right away. When the baby is feeling hungry, that's what makes him cry because he really does feel discomfort, hunger. And he needs to get out of the displeasure of the hunger pains right away. That's why the pleasure principle, the id will tell him he needs to be fed right away, because later a baby is going to react to this situation of displeasure, is to, as we said, cry, of course. Now, crying is the only thing he can do to, it's kind of like an alarm. The alarm is saying, I'm feeling something that is very intense. Now, you'll probably notice that the cries, if you don't come with the bottle right away, it's going to start crying louder and louder, and it's going to become intolerable. Well, that's actually what's happening inside his brain at that point. He is really under extreme pressure that is starting to become just unbearable. And that's the id. What the id does. It's going to apply pressure. It's going to continue and apply that pressure until something happens. If there is not some sort of solution that is brought quickly to that pressure, there's going to be a severe breakdown. That kind of reminds me of new parents. Sometimes I'll see this, the new parents kind of jokingly about their baby. They feel like he's about to die if he doesn't get that bottle right away. And it's actually, though he's not going to die, obviously, but it's kind of true in the sense that there is so much pressure on the psyche that it is a question of life and death. To him, it really is. He doesn't understand time. He doesn't understand the outside world. He doesn't understand that, mommy's getting the bottle ready, or daddy, or whatever. He can't understand that. So it really does feel like, oh, I'm dying right now. If I don't get that bottle, I'm going to die. So that's why those cries are so intense, stronger and stronger. And maybe what we'll do is, or what he'll do is start under thumb or putting things in his mouth, because that's going to allow him to tolerate, going to hallucinate into his mouth until it actually does, from extreme discomfort from that very... Remember we said that the id doesn't have any, is not influenced by the outside experience, outside world. What happens is that there are going to be the two other instances that are in contact with the outside world that are going to take over as they develop in the psyche, as the baby grows. They're going to be able to deal with the id's demands in a different way. Now, early on, they're not, the other instances, we're going to talk about the ego specifically next, the next step. The ego is the one who's going to have to deal with the id. So we've got the id, which is a very small child who's got some important demands and needs that need to be met right away. The id is going to apply this pressure on the ego until the ego finds a solution. This pressure is the sense of displeasure. Remember, displeasure is against the pleasure principle. So the ego has to fix this situation. Now, right away, the answer that the ego is going to find is to give the id what it wants. The id is saying, feed me, hold me, whatever, I'm cold, all of those things. And the ego is going to find a way to do it. Now we're going to look at how the ego is going to be able to figure out a solution. It's immediate. Okay, I'm just going to add in a side note here, because I think it's important to understand that though what we're talking about right now might seem a little bit abstract, we have to go to the basics, get to the basics before we can start understanding how this all affects our behavior. And other than that, how this influences our ability to cope with the outside reality, and how that makes us happy and unhappy. The idea being that what we're going to encounter are symptoms in life, which is what we could call neuroses. We'll go deeper into neuroses in another session, but obviously we first need to look at the players. You could imagine that the three instances, id, ego, and superego, are players or actors in a play. They each have a role, they have a script, and they're going to interact with each other. That interaction is going to give something, is going to produce something. So maybe, a whole story. Something is going to come out of that. Now, sometimes that story in question is not a happy one. And then that's what makes us suffer, is that there's conflict. The conflict comes from within, in a place that is subconscious. So we don't actually have access to it. Now, that's why it's important to understand for ourselves, but also if we're going to be in a therapeutical position, to understand how that works, how the different players are built, so that we can figure out where the conflict is. Once you figure it out, there's nothing magic about that. It's just that because you're putting something, a subconscious conflict is accessing your conscious mind. When that happens, when that process simmers up to the top, so from the of your conscious mind, that's when the symptom disappears. And that's when you feel liberated. That's when you feel like you've finally let go of the weight that was crushing down on you. That's the purpose. I'm just putting that back in mind, because sometimes we talk about certain concepts in psychoanalysis that seem very disconnected from any kind of reality or any kind of behavioral disorders. But that's where they stem from. And that subconscious is really what we need to understand so that we can solve the mystery or the conflict is what I'm referring to. Let's get back to the ego now. The ego is what we call the regulator. He's or the mediator. He's the guy, let's say, in our theater play, who's going to be able to find a solution for the id. The id who's got these demands that need to be met right away. He's the maybe not necessarily wise, but let's say he's in touch with reality, and is going to be able to find a solution to the problem. Let's imagine that we're talking about two friends who are trying to get your attention, and they're constantly trying to get for you to listen to them. These two friends are id and superego. We haven't talked about superego yet. Put that character into play now, and imagine that ego, the guy who's in between these two friends, id and superego, who are both really trying to get his attention and want to be listened to. Now, maybe ego, let's say your ego, maybe you want to satisfy these two friends because they're friends after all. And you want to find a compromise. Compromise is the ego's primary function. So that's why we call him the mediator, because he's going to find a compromise that is acceptable to my friend id and my friend superego. Let's take an example just for fun. Let's say that id, so Mr. Id, really wants to go out. He wants to go out and party all night long. And just have fun right away. Pleasure principle, remember? So he wants satisfaction of his pleasure drives right away. So let's go out. Let's go out. Superego, my friend superego, is going to say, no, 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 no. We can't go out tonight because tomorrow morning we have to go to work. I've got an important meeting to prepare, and I need to be clear-headed. I need to be able to get a good night's sleep, and I've got a lot of work to do. So no, we're not going anywhere. Between these two drastic positions, and tries to figure out a compromise. Why is this compromise important? Because id and superego will not let go. They're going to keep gnawing at you until you figure out a solution. So why the ego has this role of compromise and of mediator? Because if not, pressure is going to build. It's going to continue to put that pressure on the ego, and superego is also going to continue to put his pressure on ego. So that pressure is coming from both ends. These are high levels. This is what we really feel. This is what's going on in our minds when we feel stressed out, when we feel anxiety. Now, we'll talk about anxiety later because that's a whole different, it's a whole matter in itself. Could say that when you feel anxiety, this is what's going on. It's because the ego is suffering from the pressure that he's getting on one hand from the id and on the other hand from superego.